Right, Shabbat Shalom. So let's assume that this story is set in a time when there's not a war going on in Israel and people are going there as tourists, right? And so an El Al plane is about to land. It's coming in for a landing at Ben Gurion Airport, and it's the morning of December 25th. Okay, so the purser gets on the loudspeaker and says, "We're about to land we're getting ready to land at Ben Gurion Airport in Tel Aviv. Please remain seated with your seatbelt securely fastened until the plane has reached the terminal and the pilot has turned off the seatbelt sign." To those of you who are seated with your seatbelts on, Merry Christmas. To those of you standing in the aisle getting your luggage down, welcome home. Well, okay. For those of you who, what? I know I've told you. Okay. So, but anyway, traveling independently in Israel, it's not like going on a bus tour, okay? And I think, most Americans who visit Israel, at least if it's their first time, they go on an organized tour, right? Where you've got your own bus or your own driver, and you've got, it's set up for you in the restaurants and whatever. But if you travel independently, you live a little bit more like regular Israelis live, okay? And Israelis, they push, okay? And they don't wait online, okay? Now, two incidents from when Kelly and I were in Israel together, where she got really, really mad at me, okay? The first time when we were in a restaurant and we were waiting for a table, and this couple got up from their table and I sat down. And she, Charles, said, "What?" She said, "You have to wait until they clear off the table." And I said, "You can't just sit down because somebody else got up." And I said, "Well, if you want to eat dinner tonight, then this is what we do, okay? This is Israel. This is not Baltimore or, Atlanta, okay?" And then the second time was when we were waiting for a bus, and I don't mean a tour bus. I mean, a public transportation bus. And, the bus comes and I'm like, right, pushing people out of the way with my elbow. And again, she says, "Charles," and I said, "Kelly, do you want to get on the bus or do you want to stand here all day?" Okay, because this is the way it's done in Israel, okay? You don't have to like it. You don't have to agree with it, but it's a different culture. It's a different culture. Okay, now in the Parsha, God says through Moses to the Israelite people, "See, I have imparted to you laws and rules as the Lord my God has commanded me for you to abide by in the land that you are about to enter and occupy. Observe them faithfully, for that will be proof of your wisdom and discernment to other peoples, who on hearing of all these laws will say, 'Surely that great nation is a wise and discerning people.'" In other words, right, and this is not the only place in the Torah where it says something like this, right? I mean, we often within Jewish life have these debates between universalism and particularism, right? I mean, is Judaism, right, is our existence as Jews for the sake of the Jewish people, or is our existence as Jews for the sake of the whole world, right? And the answer is actually both, right? I mean, okay, so you guys know me, so you know I'm gonna say that, but it's true, right? I mean, we are supposed to live as Jews and be the best Jews that we can be as an example to others, so that people will look at us and say, oh, this is the way people are supposed to live, right? It doesn't necessarily mean that people will then want to become Jewish, right? But it does mean that people will want to have a relationship with God and live by at least the universal laws that God has given, right? So our existence is both for its own sake and for the sake of the world, right? And so we sanctify God through our behavior in the eyes of non-Jews, right? That's right. So you know, right, the phrase Chilul Hashem, right? Chilul Hashem means what? A desecration of God's name, right? But when do we use that phrase, a Chilul Hashem, right? A Chilul Hashem is when, like, a visibly and publicly religious Jew behaves immoral, right? Like, remember when I was a kid, there was this Orthodox rabbi in New York who owned a bunch of nursing homes, Bernard Bergman, right? And there were all kinds of scandals about how, people were cheated, whatever. That was a Chilul Hashem, right? Or, Bernie Madoff, that's a Chilul Hashem, right? Or, if you prefer Yiddish to Hebrew, a shanda for the goy, right? Right? It means essentially the same thing. Okay, so there is this pretty interesting thinker, a guy by the name of Noah Feldman, who's a professor at Harvard Law School. Okay, and he just wrote a book about like a guide to Jewish life, which I haven't read. I mean, I'm sure it's interesting, but like the pile of interesting books which I have bought but not yet read is getting too high, right? So I'm on a book moratorium until I read a couple of more. But Noah Feldman grew up in the modern Orthodox community in Brookline. He went to a school called the Maimonides School, which was founded by Rabbi Joseph Soloveitchik. And Maimonides was the first day school in the country, the first high school to be, that is to say, Orthodox high school that was co-ed and taught both boys and girls home. Okay, and Noah Feldman wrote an article in the New York Times, in the Sunday magazine, a number of years ago about breaking away from his Orthodox background. Okay, and he told this story, and I'm not going to read everything. I'll kind of summarize. So here's the question, right? Here is the question. You're a doctor, okay? Is it allowed to violate Shabbat to save the life of a non-Jew? Is it allowed? I mean, you don't even really have to be a doctor, anybody, right? You could, your next door neighbor gets really sick and you have to drive them to the hospital or whatever, right? Is it allowed to violate Shabbat to save the life of a non-Jew?
Yeah.
Of course. Okay, who says of course?
Yeah.
All right. Anybody say no?
Well, it's tricky
It's
because not so much now, but earlier, if a Jew let somebody who wasn't Jewish die, it would look really bad. Ergo, you say,
Exactly, right, you did, so you're ahead of me, okay, so for those of you who say it is allowed, why? Why is it allowed? Why is it allowed?
Human life is more valuable than any
Okay, so to you, it's like self-evident, right? Self-evident, human life overrides any kind of ritual observance, right? And that would be the intuition of most people, right? The problem is that when the Talmud deals with this, it says, Halel alav Shabbat ahad kedei she'yishmor Shabbatot hardeh. Okay, which means violate for his sake one Shabbat so that he may observe many Shabbats, right? In other words, you're basically, increasing the economy of observed Shabbats, right? That, if we could personify Shabbat, Shabbat is happy that you do this because, right, so the person will observe many Shabbatot in the future. Yeah, right.
Well, the problem is, to go back to your original question, if they're not Jewish, they don't observe the same Shabbat that we observe. So that's why I think it's tricky like Gail, because they're not obligated to follow the same Shabbos, so why are we, or any Shabbos, so why are we saving them, breaking our own Shabbos to save them, for them to continue to do something that they're not required to do?
Exactly, right, that's exactly it, okay, so that's the problem, right? I mean, you cannot use that logic to violate Shabbat to save the life of the non-Jew. Okay, now, the halakha does get what I think we would all agree, get to the right conclusion, right? Which is, yes, you violate Shabbat to save the life of a non-Jew. How it gets there, right, is something which may be kind of near and dear to those of us who are, even have studied either law or Talmud, right? But is problematic, okay? Basically, here's the deal. I mean, Gail kind of hinted it, right? If it becomes known that Jews will let non-Jews die rather than violate Shabbat to save them, this is bad for the Jews, right? This is bad. This is like bad for the Jews, right? So we violate Shabbat to save the non-Jew, not because of the intrinsic value of the life of the non-Jew, but because to not do so would cause anti-Semitism, right? So basically, so in Feldman's story, so this prominent modern Orthodox doctor came to Maimonides school and he gave a lecture on, and by the way, lawyers have the same thing, and almost any profession that you practice, there is an intersection between the practice of your profession and halakha that you have to be able to understand. I know I spoke at least once about the question of practicing law as a Jew, and frankly, if you're not Orthodox, you probably don't care, but you don't have to be Orthodox to care about halakha, right? And the halakha says a Jew is not allowed to sue another Jew in secular court. You have to bring them to a rabbinic court, right? So theoretically, if you're a lawyer, you're not allowed to file a lawsuit against for a Jewish client against another Jew without at least attempting to convince them to go to a Beit Din first, okay? But at any rate, so the doctor said, you know, that of course we save the lives of a non-Jew, right? Of course. And after the doctor's talk, one of the teachers in the school said that he had a problem with what the doctor said because the doctor didn't like go all the way, right? He didn't, and he said, yes, the bottom line is you save the life of the non-Jew, but the question is, what's your state of mind while you're doing it? In other words, if you do it because you intrinsically value the life of the non-Jew, you violated Shabbat. Okay, if you do it because you don't want to cause anti-Semitism, then you've observed Shabbat. Okay, and then afterwards, the teacher went back to his class and said, I have to apologize for having said what I said. Okay, I have to apologize for having said what I said. I shouldn't have said that because there were non-Jews in the room. Okay, and they shouldn't know that, right? In other words, we should do, but like it should be a secret because, you know, even even sort of knowing that the only reason that we save non-Jews on Shabbat is to prevent anti-Semitism, that also could cause anti-Semitism, right? And I've also read, you know, there are rabbis in Israel who say that this doesn't apply in Israel, right? Because in Israel, we don't have to worry about anti-Semitism, right? So now, I am not aware of any cases where it has actually been applied, and it actually wouldn't matter because, again, this is something that most people don't know about Israel, is that Israeli Arabs are actually overrepresented in the Israeli medical system, right? If you go to a doctor or a hospital or a clinic or whatever, there's a very good chance that the nurses and the doctors who take care of you will be Palestinian Arabs with Israeli citizenship. Okay, and for all kinds of reasons, including the fact that they don't go to the army. So they have a 3-4 year head start on Jewish Israelis because they can go right from high school to college. Okay, but you know, so when Feldman published this, of course, there was a big scandal, right? Because, you know, I mean, look, unfortunately, there's no setting on YouTube for Jews only, right? So, you know, maybe I shouldn't be talking about this either, right? But the point is that, you know, afterwards, a lot of people said that Feldman, you know, made that up or it wasn't true or whatever. I don't really know, right? But the thing is that everything that I've said doesn't actually necessarily apply, okay? Because there's another way to get to the right answer, okay? There was a commentator, a rabbi who lived in Provence in the 13th century, named Menachem HaMeiri, and he was a significant source, and he wrote about Umot Hagedurot B'darkei Hadat, which means nations bound by the ways of religion, right? In other words, look, if you look at the Torah, right, there are a lot of very, very, very harsh provisions about our relationship with idolaters, okay? Meiri says, yes, those rules apply to our relationship with idolaters. But Christians and Muslims are not idolaters, right? The world is not divided between Jews and idolaters, right? It's divided, you could say, right, I mean, there are two kinds of people in the world, right? Those who say there are two kinds of people in the world and those who don't, right? And, you could just as easily say there are two types of people in the world, monotheists and non-monotheists, right? So the point is that those laws do not apply to our relationship with Christians and Muslims, because they're also monotheists, and not just a matter of ritual, it's a matter of morality, right? That we don't talk just about monotheism, but about ethical monotheism, right? Because you could believe in one God, and that one God, doesn't teach us a morality, right? But essentially, and this is not always easy to believe or accept, but Mary says essentially, Christian and Muslim morality is the same as Jewish morality, right? And therefore, in terms of social interactions with Christians and Muslims, we treat them the same as Jews. Not ritually, right? I mean, the imam can't walk in here and we say he's the 10th man, right? But, so not in terms of ritual, but in terms of our social everyday interaction, right? Christians and Muslims, we treat the same way as Jews, right? Because Meiri goes on to say that, there are things in the Torah that, frankly, on surface, actually tell us to treat idolaters in ways that would strike us as immoral, right? Like, take no prisoners, right? When you conquer a city, right, don't take any prisoners, kill them, right? I mean, to most of us, that would strike us as immoral, right? But Meiri says, the assumption is that you are fighting an enemy that has no moral code, right? And when you're fighting an enemy that has no moral code, and you act by a moral code, right? You are handicapping yourselves, right? I mean, for example, this is much later, right? But during the Maccabees revolt against Greece, right? At first they didn't fight on Shabbat, right? And then when the Greeks picked up and said, we'll just wait until Saturday and we'll kill all the Jews. So we gotta fight on Shabbat, right? So, when you are fighting an enemy that has no moral code, then you have no moral code, right? But when you're dealing with people who do have a moral code, then you act accordingly, right? Okay, so the question then becomes, right, what about when Israel is fighting Hamas, right? Or when Israel is fighting Hezbollah, right? Or God forbid, Iran, right? I mean, they clearly have no moral code, right? They clearly have no, by them, it's a mitzvah to kill Jews, period, right? It's a mitzvah to kill Jews, right? And so how do you fight an enemy that has no moral code, right? And we see this all the time, right? Because there are rules of war, right? Are you allowed to drop bombs on a school? No, you're not allowed to drop bombs on a school. But are you allowed to put rocket launchers in a school? No, right? If you put rocket launchers in a school, it's not a school anymore. It's a rocket launch, it's a missile base, right? If you have your command and control headquarters in a hospital, it's not a hospital, it's the command and control headquarters, right? So that becomes a very, very difficult, dilemma, right? It becomes a very difficult dilemma as to how you fight an enemy that has no moral code, right? And in fact, they almost take delight, right? When Israel kills civilians, that's good for our cause, right? Doesn't hurt them because they're now a shaheed and they go to heaven, right? And it makes Israel look bad, it hurts Israel. So, but at the same time, right, it doesn't mean that all bets are off, right? And this is really the dilemma, right? I mean, and I have to tell you, I do not for a minute believe the health ministry of Gaza that says 40,000 civilians have been killed. No, I don't believe that at all, because first of all, that includes all of the Hamas soldiers who've been killed, who are certainly not civilians, and they're fair game. But having said that, way too many civilians have been killed, and you can certainly make the case quite plausibly that every one of those deaths can be laid at the foot of Hamas, but it doesn't make Israel look good, right? And it doesn't make Israel look good when settlers in the West Bank go on rampages and commit pogroms, right? I mean, and it's not just that it's like bad, it is in fact, a Chilul Hashem, right? So that kind of, what they call technically asymmetrical warfare, right, is very, very different and is very, very difficult, rather. And, ultimately, it also depends on, I know I've told this story once before, I'm pretty sure I have, but I've a friend, well, actually, he doesn't live in Israel anymore, but he was in the Israeli army during the 1982 Lebanon War. And he was in the unit called Handasa Kravit. Handasa Kravit means combat engineering. Okay, but combat engineering, what does combat engineering mean? Blowing stuff up, right? So I mean, I would love to be in that, right? But anyway, so he's in this combat engineering battalion, and they're in Lebanon, and they come to a village whose inhabitants have fled, right? And the commander of the unit says, great, practice, right? We can blow up the village without hurting any civilians because they've all fled, right? And so this is a good opportunity for us to practice. And my friend Aryeh goes to his commander and says, you know that this is a violation of IDF regulations. Okay, so A, I'm not participating. B, if you go ahead and do it anyway, I'm reporting you up the chain of command. And guess what? They didn't blow up the village, right? They didn't blow up. All it took was one person to say, this is wrong, right? And that, I mean, we should all be that person. right? We should all be that person and say, this is wrong, right? But, it's also a risk. I mean, the commander could have thrown RA in jail, right? And the commander also, he had a conscience that ultimately could be appealed to, right? But the point is, on the one hand, I don't want to minimize the difficulty of fighting an enemy that has no moral code. On the other hand, fighting an enemy that has no moral code doesn't entitle you to completely throw out your moral code either, right? And I have to say, God willing, right? God and the major powers willing, right? Enough pressure will be put on both sides when the talk resumed this week to get a ceasefire, to get the hostages home, and to stop the killing. There's no alternative, right? And frankly, I really hope that the organized Jewish community doesn't put pressure on the American administration not to force Israel's hand. I really think this, and you can be free to disagree, but, and I also have to, I have a lot of friends in Israel, okay? And I don't have a single friend in Israel who does not believe that Netanyahu is prolonging the war for his own political purposes. Every Israeli I know believes that, okay? And so the pressure has to come, and this has to stop. Shabbat shalom. Okay, so we won't do a repetition, but we can move over to the Torah service now.
I'll stop.
You got it?
Yeah.